Hey everyone, in this video we're going to finish off the story of Atys by doing the last and final part, right? Part 3 of this short Latin story. So again, this is coming from Easy Latin Stories for Beginners from George L. Bennett from the late 1800s. And like you've heard me say in a lot of these videos that I've done from Bennett, what he's calling easy and saying is for beginners is not necessarily what I would classify them as. They're not particularly easy, and they're also not necessarily for beginners, right? It kind of depends on your level. So I would say that this is not really a story you'd be able to read in a traditional kind of Latin 1 class, whether that's in high school or middle school. It's probably a little beyond. I would say this is probably best suited for maybe that Latin 2 or 3 range. When you have a couple of years of Latin under your belt, you've seen a little bit more advanced forms. Bennett gets into all the tenses, active, passive voice, some subjunctive, just things that you probably wouldn't see in that sort of Latin 1 level. So it kind of depends on where you are. If you're a student, I always say, if you're interested, try it. And if you're able to read it, perfect. If you're not, move on, right? If you're seeing forms that you just don't understand or don't recognize, don't worry about it. You can always come back later. But if you are in that sort of Latin 2 range and you've seen this before, it's a really great way to break free of a traditional textbook or curriculum and just read something different, right? Something that'll kind of test you and let you read, just something that you wouldn't normally see. Bennett is great for doing mythology, some history. Some of his stories have sort of a moral, almost like a fable value to them. So they're just a nice way to do something different, and they are pretty short. And if you're at the right level, they are pretty straightforward to understand. So again, that would be my advice if you're a student. If you're a teacher, probably that Latin 2 or 3 range. Again, it's just a great way to do something different. So like I always say, the first thing you want to do is, if you are trying to read these and really understand it, you might want to do a pre-read and just get some vocab. These stories are very, very old, so I don't think you're going to find a vocab list from Bennett. You might. That would be cool if someone's made one. But if not, just pre-read it. Try to look up any words you don't know. It's pretty easy with online tools like Alpheos, for instance, is one I use a lot. There's a bunch that you can find where you can pretty quickly do this. That way you just have a shot of understanding what the words are. The other thing I always say, read it aloud, right? If you can find a classmate, anyone that you can read this story to, work on your speaking, your pronunciation, they can read it back to you and you can work on your listening skills. That's how you bring the language to life, right? And these are pretty short stories. They're fun. They should be read. I'll read it aloud to you, this last part, as we start the video. But again, my pronunciation is nothing fantastic. So it's always better if you do it, work on it. Just another fun way to practice. And if you are trying to translate this and really understand it, make sure you're in a good spot, I would recommend the read and reread method. So when you read through this chunk of the story, write down any problem areas you have. When you're done with the read, look them over and try to see where you went wrong, fix them, and just repeat that process over and over again until you're able to read this start to finish without too much trouble. That's how you know you're in a good spot and you understand it. Okay, so if you haven't done any of that, pause the video, go back, do all that. Otherwise, let's work our way through and pick up the story where we left off. Remember, at this point, you have Atys, the son of King Croesus, and there's been a prophecy that Atys is going to die, pierced by an iron weapon. So the king has basically kept his son at home and not let him out. And in the background, you have this wild boar that's been running around, eating everything, destroying people's property. So in part 2, we saw that the people have said to King Croesus, hey, you got to kill this boar, send out your son. And he says, no, I'm not sending my son, but maybe I'll send some young boys and some hunting dogs, right? And then you have Atys, who steps up in part 2 and says, how am I going to look anyone in the face if I don't go out and do this, right? They're all going to think I'm a coward. So you're starting to see where this is going and how it's going to end. And now we're going to see in part 3 what Atys does and how he kind of meets his fate. Okay, so let's start by reading the story, and then we'll kind of unpack it one line at a time. Okay, so the story goes like this. Iovrosos adolescens ita locutus est, ferea cuspide me trajectum vidisti, at apro quaenam sunt manus, quae ferea cuspis? Nihil dictum est de injuria a dentibus suscepta. Quare abire me patere, mi pater, tum Croesus, fili ait, me vincis, sententiam somnii declarans, itaque veniam tibi do venatum exeundi. His dictis adrastum advocatum ita allocutus est. Adraste, ego te calamitate obstrictum expiavi, et in meas aides recepi. Nunc ergo debes enim de me bene mereri, custos sis filii mei venatum exeuntis. Respondit Adrastus, paratus sum exequi mandatum, filios tuus, o rex, custode me, in columis redibit. Proficiscuntur, igitur, cum delectis juvenibus canibusque, belluam inventam jaculis adoriuntur. casu adrastus croisi filium fere, itaque ille cuspide ictus somni monitum explet. Croisos filii morte nuntiata, consternatus est. Adratus se tradidit croiso. Interfice me, dixit, super cadavere filii. Illi croisos, ignosco tibi adraste, illud invitus fecisti, non tu auctor est huius mali, sed deorum aliquis. Hoc mihi somnium iam pridem significavit. Adrastus autem se ipse super busto jugulavit. Croisos vero, filio orbatus, duos annos ingenti in luctu remansit. Okay, so we're going to pause the video there. And again, if you want to go back, listen to it again, not that it's anything perfect, but it'll give you a little guideline of how to pronounce it. And you should work on your own, right? Read the story to yourself, try to bring it to life. But for now, let's work our way through and just take it a little piece at a time and understand what the plot is, okay? So again, it starts with this. You have Rosus adolescens. So you have, again, the young man, right? The adolescent, if you will. He spoke in this way, ita locutus est. So he starts talking. And this is Atys, the son. And he says, Pharea cuspide. So you saw me. Vidisti me is the you saw me. Then you have triectum pharea cuspide. So the triectum is having been like stabbed or pierced by an iron weapon, a pharea cuspide, right? So he's been pierced. He says, you saw this in your dream. He says, but, right, at apro quinam, he says, but what hands are there for a boar? So you have at apro quinam sunt manus. So he's saying a boar doesn't have any hands. So how is a boar going to stab me, right? So he says, quaeque pharea cuspis. He says, but what hands, are there for a boar, or what iron weapon? So he has a point. He's like, I'm chasing a boar here, Dad. How's it going to stab me? The thing doesn't have hands, right? Which is a good point. Then you have nihil dictum est de injuria a dentibus suscepta. He says nothing was said about an injury, right, an injuria received from teeth a dentibus. And he's probably talking about the tusks of the boar. So he's like, the boar only has tusks, right? What's going to happen? It doesn't have a weapon, and there was nothing in your prophecy about teeth, right? So I should be fine. And he says, quare abire me patere mi pater, right? So he says, for what reason or why do you not allow me to leave, right? Do you not sort of suffer or allow me to go out? Abire mi pater, my father, right? So he says, come on now, I've kind of gotten away from your one reason. So what reason do you have left? Why won't you let me leave? Okay. Then Croesus said, right? You have to imply, you have I there. So he literally said, he says, filii, right? Son. Me winkies, you defeat me is kind of literally what it means. But he means like you've kind of proven your point, right? You've overcome me. I get it. You win is kind of his point. And he says you defeat me declarans, right? Or explaining or declaring the sententiam somnii, the meaning of the dream. So sententiam there, usually we see it as like, it can be sentence. It usually more is like opinion. Here you probably best off translate it meaning, right? To make it make sense. So it's like, you got me, right? You win, explaining the meaning of the dream. You're right. It says itaque, and so veniam tibi do venatum exeundi. So I will give you permission, right? I'll give you the permission for going out to hunt. Venatum exeundi, right? So he says, it's fine. I'll give you your permission to go do this hunt. So here we have Atys going out, right? And we can see this is probably not going to be a good idea, okay? Then it continues. You have his dictis. So having said these things, right? Adrastum advocatum ita allocutus est. So he addressed, or he kind of spoke to Adrastus, right? You could say he kind of addressed Adrastus, having been called advocatum adrastum. So it's sort of like, having been summoned, right? He spoke to Adrastus, right? Which is, remember, the stranger who is now part of his house. And he says Adraste, right? So he's talking to him. He says, Adrastus, right? Ego te calamitate obstructum expiavi. He says, I purified you. Expiavi means like purified, kind of like forgave you is really what it means. I forgave you. You having been involved with this disaster, right? Calamitate says, I purified you. Kind of like when you were, involved with this calamity, right? Because remember, he killed someone. And he says, and I welcomed you, right? Recepi, I welcomed you into meas ides, into my home, right? Into my halls or home. So he's like, I welcomed you in when this happened. And he says, nunc ergo, right? So now, therefore, debes enim de me bene merere, right? He says, for you, you ought to deserve well of me is kind of what that really says, right? So debes, you ought to deserve me bene, right? Well of me. It kind of means like you ought to deserve my gratitude is kind of what he's getting at here, right? And he says, "Kustos sis filii," you will be, right? The sis, subjunctive there, says you will be the kustos filii, the guardian to my son or of my son, and it's my son, mei filiis, right? Of my son. Venatum exeuntus, going out on the hunt, right? Or going out to hunt. So he says, you're going to be the one who guards my son, right? That's going to be your job. I welcome you in. Now you owe me. Keep my son safe. Okay. Then you have responde adrastus, right? Adrastus responds, and he says, paratus sum, I am prepared. I am ready. Exequi mandatum, to carry out the order. He says, I'm good. We got this, right? Filius tuus orex custode me in columis redibet. So he says, your son, O king, with me as a guard, custode me, right? With me as a guardian. Remember that when you have that ablative absolute there without the participle, you kind of imply being, right? So custode me is probably best translated as with me as a guard. He says, your son will return, redibet, right? He will return in columis, safe and sound. So he says, don't worry about it. I've got your son. We're going on the boar hunt. It'll all be fine. Okay. And you have therefore, right, igitor proficiscuntur, they set out with the delectis in juvenibus canibusque. So with the chosen young men, the delectis juvenibus, right, the selected men, and with dogs. So there they go. The young men, the dogs, they get the posse. They're going to kill the boar. Then you have belluum inventam jaculis adoriuntur. So having found the beast, right, the belluum inventam, having found the beast, they attacked it with javelins. So you could almost say like they attack the beast having been found, right? Jaculis with javelins, they're throwing things at this beast, okay? And now you can kind of see what's going on. The beast isn't going to be the one. The boar isn't going to kill him. It's all the other guys throwing weapons. So here you have the kind of plot point. You have casu adrastus croisi filium fere. So by chance, or almost like by accident, casu adrastus struck the son of Croesus, right? So feret filium croisi. So here we go. Adrastus, the stranger, the one that they let in, he's the one who kills his son, Atys, right? No good. Then you have etaque ille cuspide ictus somnii monitum explet. So you have, and so he, having been hit by the weapon, cuspide ictus, having been struck by the weapon, he fulfilled or completed the warning of the dream, the monitum somnii. So now we have, like I said, in Greek culture, you cannot outrun fate no matter what you do. If it's fated that you're going to die by an iron weapon, watch out, buddy. You're going to get an iron weapon, right? So even though Croesus tried to save his son, no way to do it, right? And it's always in sort of an unexpected way. Okay, here we have Croesus, right? That's sort of end of the story. Croesus filii morte nuntiata. So you're saying Croesus, with the death of his son having been announced, right? The morte filii. So the death of his son having been announced, consternatus est. He was, you can say like horrified, right? Consternatus. He was really afraid, horrified of this. Okay. Adrastus sese tradidit Croeso. So Adrastus, right, he handed himself, that sese is just like a duplication, you see that in Caesar a lot. You can almost think of it as say, he handed himself over to Croesus, and he says, interfice me, right, here you have the command, right, the imperative, kill me, he says, right, interfice me, he says, kill me, super cadavere fili, kill me over the dead body of your son, right, the cadaver, the dead body of your son. He's like, just kill me here, I feel terrible, right, you should kill me, O king. Then you have Ili Croesus, ignosco tibi adraste, right? So he says to him, Croesus said, Ili Croesus. So he said, ignosco tibi. He says, I forgive you, adrastus, right? Ignosco tibi adraste. Illud invitus fecisti. He says, you did that that kind of act, illud fecisti. He said, you did it invitus, unwillingly, right? So he's like, it's not your fault, is basically what he's saying. He says, non tu auctor est huius mali. He says, you are not the sort of author, you could say, auctor, right? The kind of doer, the author of this evil, huius mali. He said, you're not the one who kind of brought this evil. You're not the author of it. He says, sed deorum aliquis, but one of the gods, right? Deorum aliquis. He says, you're not the one who kind of generated this evil act. Someone of the gods did. One of the gods did. And he says, hoc mihi somnium jam pridem significavit. So he says, a dream, a somnium. He says, a dream showed this to me, hoc mihi. So a dream showed this to me a long time ago, jam pridem, right? So yeah, a long time ago, significavit. It kind of pointed this out to me. So he finally kind of admits to Adrastus, I had a dream this is going to happen. It was fate. It's not your fault. Okay? Then you have Adrastus autem se ipse super busto it jugulavit, right? So Adrastus himself, however, killed himself, right? So he killed himself, Yugulawit, say, he killed himself over the corpse, superbusto, right? So he takes his own life, right? Because he feels terrible for what happened. You have Croesus vero, filio orbatus, duos annos ingenti in luctu remanset. So Croesus, deprived of his son, filio orbatus, right? Having his son taken away. He remained in great sorrow. So in ingenti lucto, in great sorrow, he remanset, he remained for 2 years, duos annos. So he's just grieving and mourning at the loss of his son. Okay, so that's the story of Atys, right? It's a really interesting one. Like I said, it's a bit longer, right? A couple of pieces here to kind of put it all together. It's one of the longer ones in Bennett, but it's a really great story based on Greek mythology, right? Croesus, these characters you can see all over the place, and this idea of not outrunning your fate. I know I keep saying it, but that is sort of the key culture point you want to get out of this is, if the fates or the gods say something will happen to you, it's going to happen. So there's no sense in trying to sort of escape from it. It's going to happen one way or another, usually in a way that you're not expecting. And that's sort of the moral of this story. No matter what you do to try to protect yourself or insulate yourself from fate, you can't outrun it. Okay, so hopefully you enjoyed the story, all 3 pieces of it, and it made sense to you, and it just gives you something to think about. If you want to dive in and look up any of this on your own, I'd highly encourage you to. There's a lot you can kind of read about it, but again, it's a fun story to just break away from a traditional textbook or curriculum, read something different, something you probably won't see in a normal Latin textbook, and it's a good story, right? It gets you thinking a little bit, kind of exposes you to the bigger world of that Mediterranean mythology, Greek mythology, things like that. So hopefully it was fun and you'd enjoyed it, right? If you have any questions at all on the translation or anything like that, feel free to put it in the comments below. But otherwise, use it as a chance to test your skills, read something, keep practicing. And like I always say, the more you read and practice, the better off you're going to be. And you're eventually trying to hit a point where you can read this without too much trouble. That's how you know you're in a good spot. Good luck.